Chapter 2, Mrs. Who. When Meg woke to the jingling of her alarm clock, the wind was still blowing, but the sun was shining. Oh, never mind. The worst of the storm was over. She sat up in bed, shaking her head to clear it. It must have been a dream. She'd been frightened by the storm and worried about the tramp, so she just dreamed about going down to the kitchen and seeing Mrs. Whatsit and having her mother get all frightened and upset by that word. What was it? Tess something? She just dressed hurriedly, picked up the kitten still curled up on the bed and dumped it unceremoniously on the floor. The kitten yawned, stretched, gave a piteous meow, trotted out of the attic and down the stairs. Meg made her bed and hurried after it. In the kitchen, her mother was making French toast, and the twins were already at the table. The kitten was lapping milk out of a saucer. "Where's Charles?" Meg asked. "Still asleep. We had rather an uninterrupted night, if you remember." "I hope it was a dream," Meg said. Her mother carefully turned over 4 slices of French toast and then said in a steady voice, "No, Meg, don't hope it was a dream. I don't understand it any more than you do. But one thing I've learned is that you don't have to understand things for them to be. I'm sorry I showed you I was upset. Your father and I used to have a joke about the Tesseract." "What is a Tesseract?" Meg asked. "It's a concept." Mrs. Murray handed the twins syrup. "I'll try to explain it to you later. There isn't time before school." "I don't see why you don't wake us up," Denny said. "It's a jip we missed out on all the fun." "You'll be a lot more awake in school today than I will." Meg took her French toast to the table. "Who cares?" Sandy said. "If you're going to let old tramps come into the house in the middle of the night, Mother, you ought to have Den and me around to protect you." "After all, Father would expect us to," Denny said. We know we have a great mind and all, Mother," Sandy said, "but you don't have much sense. Certainly Meg and Charles don't." "I know. We're morons." Meg was bitter. "I wish you wouldn't be such a dope, Meg." "Syrup, please." Sandy reached across the table. "You don't have to take everything so personally. Use a happy medium, for heaven's sake. You just goof around in school and look out the window and don't pay any attention." "You just make things harder for yourself," Dennis said. "And Charles Wallace is going to have an awful time next year when he starts school. We know he's bright, but he's so funny when he's around other people. They're so used to thinking he's dumb. I don't know what's going to happen to him, Sandy, and I'll sock anybody who picks on him. But that's about all we can do." "Let's not worry about next year till we get through this one," Mrs. Murray said. "More French toast, boys?" At school, Meg was tired, and her eyelids sagged, and her mind wandered. In social studies, she was asked the name of the principal imports and exports of Nicaragua, and though she had looked them up dutifully the evening before, now she could remember none of them. The teacher was sarcastic. The rest of the class laughed. She flung herself down in her seat in a fury. "Who cares about the imports and exports of Nicaragua anyhow?" she muttered. "If you're going to be rude, Margaret, you may leave the room," the teacher said. "Okay, I will," Meg flounced out. During study hall, the principal sent for her. "What seems to be the problem now, Meg?" he asked, pleasantly enough. Meg looked sulkily down at the floor. "Nothing, Mr. Jenkins. Miss Porter tells me you are inexcusably rude." Meg shrugged. "Don't you realize that you just make everything harder for yourself by your attitude?" the principal asked. "Now, Meg, I'm convinced that you can do the work and keep up with your grade if you will apply yourself. But some of your teachers are not. You're going to have to do something about yourself. Nobody can do it for you." Meg was silent. "Well, what about it, Meg?" "I don't know what to do," Meg said. "You could do your homework, for one thing. Wouldn't your mother help you?" "If I asked her to." "Meg, is something troubling you? Are you unhappy at home?" Mr. Jenkins said. At last Meg looked at him, pushing at her glasses in a characteristic gesture. "Everything's fine at home." Glad to hear it. But I know it must be hard on you to have your father away. Meg eyed the principal warily and ran her tongue over the barred line of braces. Have you had any news from him lately? Meg was unsure. It was not only imagination that made her feel that behind Mr. Jenkins' surface concern was a gleam of avid curiosity. Wouldn't he like to know, she thought. And if I knew anything, he's the last person I'd tell. Well, one of the last. The postmistress must know that it was almost a year now since the last letter, and heaven knows how many people she told, or what unkind guesses she made about the reason for the long silence. Mr. Jenkins waited for an answer, but Meg only shrugged. Just what was your father's line of business? Mr. Jenkins asked. Some kind of scientist, wasn't he? He is a physicist. Meg bared her teeth to reveal 2 ferocious lines of braces. Meg, don't you think you'd make a better adjustment to life if you faced facts? I do face facts, Meg said. They're a lot easier to face than people, I can tell you. Then why don't you face facts about your father? You leave my father out of it, Meg shouted. Stop bellowing, Mr. Jenkins said sharply. Do you want the entire school to hear you? So what, Meg demanded. I'm not ashamed of anything I'm saying, are you? Mr. Jenkins sighed. Do you enjoy being the most belligerent, uncooperative child in school? Meg ignored this. She leaned over the desk towards the principal. Mr. Jenkins, you've met my mother, haven't you? You can't accuse her of not facing facts, can you? She's a scientist. She has a doctor's degree in both biology and bacteriology. Her business is facts. When she tells me that my father isn't coming home, I'll believe it. As long as she says father is coming home, then I'll believe that. Mr. Jenkins sighed again. No doubt your mother wants to believe that your father is coming home, Meg. Very well. I can't do anything else with you. Going back to study hall. Try to be a little less antagonistic. Maybe your work would improve if your general attitude were more tractable. When Meg got home from school, her mother was in the lab. The twins were at Little League, and Charles Wallace, the kitten, and Fortinbras were waiting for her. Fortinbras jumped up, put his paws on her shoulder, and gave her a kiss, and the kitten rushed to his empty saucer and mewed loudly. Come on, Charles Wallace said. Let's go. Where? Meg asked. I'm hungry, Charles. I don't want to go anywhere till I've had something to eat. She was still sore from the interview with Mr. Jenkins, and her voice sounded cross. Charles Wallace looked at her thoughtfully as she went to the refrigerator and gave the kitten some milk, and then drank a mugful herself. He handed her a paper bag. Here's a sandwich, and some cookies, and an apple. I thought we'd better go see Mrs. Whatsit. Oh golly, Meg said. Why, Charles? You're still uneasy about her, aren't you? Charles asked. Well, yes. Don't be. She's all right. I promise you. She's on our side. How do you know? Meg, he said impatiently. I know. But why should we go see her now? I want you to find out more about the Tesseract thing. Didn't you see how it upset Mother? You know, when Mother can't control the way she feels, she lets us see she's upset, and then it's something big. Meg thought for a moment. Okay, let's go, but let's take Fortinbras with us. Well, of course. He needs the exercise. They set off. Fortinbras rushing ahead, then doubling back to the 2 children, then leaping off again. The Murrays lived about 4 miles out of the village. Behind the house was a pine woods, and it was through this woods that Charles took Meg. Charles, she's going to get in awful trouble, Miss Whatsit. If they find out she's broken into the haunted house and taken Mrs. Buncombe's sheets and everything, they could send her to jail. One of the reasons I want to go over this afternoon is to warn them. Them? I told you. She was there with her 2 friends. I'm not sure it was Mrs. Whatsit herself who took the sheets, but I wouldn't put it past her. But what would she want all those sheets for? I intend to ask her, Charles Wallace said, and to tell them they'd better be more careful. I don't really think they should let anybody find them, but I just thought we ought to mention the possibility. Sometimes during vacation, some of the boys go out there looking for thrills, but I don't think anybody's apt to right now. What, with basketball and everything? They walked in silence for a moment through the fragrant woods, the rusty pine needles gentle under their feet. Up above them the wind made music in the branches. Charles Wallace slipped with his hands confidingly in Meg's, and the sweet little boy gesture warmed her so that she felt the tense knot inside her begin to loosen. Charles loves me at any rate, she thought. School awful again today? He asked after a while. Yes, I got sent to Mr. Jenkins. He made snide remarks about father. Charles Wallace nodded sagely. I know. How do you know? Charles Wallace shook his head. I can't quite explain. You tell me, that's all. But I never say anything. You just seem to know. Everything about you tells me, Charles said. How about the twins, Meg asked. Do you know about them too? I suppose I could if I wanted to, if they needed me, but it's sort of tiring, so I just concentrate on you and Mother. You mean you can read our minds? Charles Wallace looked troubled. I don't think it's that. It's being able to understand a sort of language, like sometimes if I concentrate very hard, I can understand the wind talking with the trees. You tell me you see sort of inadvertently. That's a good word, isn't it? I got Mother to look it up in the dictionary for me this morning. I really must learn to read, except I'm afraid it will make awfully hard for me in the school next year if I already know things. I think it would be better if people go on thinking I'm not very bright. They won't hate me quite so much. Ahead of Fortinbras started barking loudly, the warning bay that usually told them there was a car coming up the road or that someone was at the door. Something's there, Charles Wallace said sharply. Somebody's hanging around the house. Come on. He started to run, his short legs straining at the edge of the woods. Fortinbras stood in front of the boy, barking furiously. As they came panting up, the boy said, For crying out loud, call off your dog. Who is he? Charles Wallace asked Meg. Calvin O'Keefe. He's in regional, but he's older than I am. He's a big bug. All right, fella, I'm not going to hurt you, the boy said to Fortinbras. Sit, Fort, Charles Wallace commanded. And Fortinbras dropped to his hunches onto the front boy. In a low growl, still pulsing in his dark throat. Okay, Charles Wallace put his hands on his hips. Now, tell us what you're doing here. I might ask the same of you, the boy said with some indignation. Aren't you two of the Murray kids? This isn't your property, is it? He started to move, but Fortinbras' growl grew louder and he stopped. Tell me about him, Meg, Charles Wallace demanded. What would I know about him? Meg asked. He's a couple of grades above me, and he's on the basketball team. Just because I'm tall, sounded a little embarrassed. Tall he certainly was, and skinny. His bony wrists stuck out of the sleeves of his blue sweater. His worn corduroy trousers were 3 inches too short. He had orange hair that needed cutting, and the appropriate freckles to go with it. His eyes were an oddly bright blue. That's where we're ending tonight.